States. This war, as most wars, either provoked changes in military technology, military organization, military strategies, or accelerated those changes. And of course, many people are familiar with the more visible changes, such as the development of ironclad naval vessels and the development of rifled cannons that could damage, if not demolish, the brick and masonry walls of forts that had been constructed just before the war began. But there were also changes in tactics, of course. With the widespread use of rifled muskets, tactics had to change, because rifled muskets, of course, had a much greater range than the older smoothbore muskets. But some of the changes that were not as visible had to do with organizational structure. This war was unprecedented in its size, which of course you all know. I think many people in the general public who may not read that much about the war don't appreciate how vast, how big this war was, and the challenges it presented in terms of organizing forces. I was speaking in my class today. I was teaching a U.S. history survey class. It's the first half of U.S. history, and we're nearing the end of the semester, and we were talking about the war. And I was telling them that many of the people who died in the war weren't wounded, weren't killed in combat. They died from disease, or from dysentery, or from exposure, or from other problems that grew out of the difficulties in organizing just the training camps for these huge armies. You look back to the previous war, the Mexican War, and if I remember, there was one large expeditionary force, approximately 50,000 men, and it took part in one series of campaigns, and the war lasted for the better part of 2 years. And generally speaking, it wasn't back and forth, it was one of linear progress. That is, the United States Army went in and it accomplished its goals. This war was much more involved. And it's not that the two sides didn't have the resources, it was just figuring out how to organize those resources. I was talking about a particular example from the beginning of the movie Gone with the Wind, Scarlett O'Hara's first husband. And I asked the class how many people had seen Gone with the Wind. A lot of people had seen it. But this part's relatively obscure. Her first husband died, I believe, from measles at the beginning of the war before he even had a chance to get into combat. One of the other things they had to figure out was, how do you select officers for all of these units that will be fighting in the war? And by one count, the Confederate Army organized 642 infantry regiments. An infantry regiment being roughly 1,000 men. That's a lot of men. Not only do you have to select the officers for each infantry regiment, and most of these infantry regiments were volunteer regiments. They were not part of the Confederate regular army. Then you had to pick the officers for each of the companies in those regiments. And generally speaking, an infantry regiment that had 10 companies, and if there were, say, a captain, a first lieutenant, a second lieutenant, and a third lieutenant for each company, that's 40 officers right off the bat that have to be selected. And that's for 642 infantry regiments. That doesn't include the 137 cavalry regiments. Again, this is just one count. And 227 artillery batteries. So this goes beyond being a nightmare. I mean, you're just jumping into the water, thrown in, trying to figure out how to swim, having had a lesson. Initially, the process that was used is one that, well, you guys are all familiar with this, but I was talking to my students about this, and it just amazed me. The men of the companies elected their officers. And I have several students who are in the National Guard, the Tennessee National Guard. And one of them just started laughing. I mean, it wasn't just chuckling, and he got control of himself. And I knew what he was talking about, but he was just thinking it would be a different kettle of fish if his promotion could be secured sergeant, and I've talked to my wife's cousin about this as well, and he knows about it, but it still amazes him because what he's got today is a set of criteria that he follows. It's written down as to when he can be eligible for promotion to the next grade and what he has to do to secure that promotion. But for these companies, no. And again, this is because nobody had had any experience with any sort of struggle of this size. The roots of this idea of electing your officers go back to an earlier period, a generation earlier, that was dominated by one man, Andrew Jackson. And when I talk about it in U.S. history, I refer to it as the Jacksonian period. The idea behind the Jacksonian period is that every man should be allowed to vote regardless of how much property he owns or doesn't own. That shouldn't be a criteria. And Jackson epitomized it. He came from very modest circumstances. He built his way up. And he ended up being president of the United States. And he also demonstrated that he was a very successful military commander, especially at the Battle of New Orleans. He's sort of the model for all of these officers who were elected as either lieutenants or captains for their companies, or as field officers for the regiments. After Jackson, there were other men who were models of this. They're the kind of men who make things look so easy that it appears anybody can do them. And of course, Nathan Bedford Forrest is one such individual. He was a self-made man before the war. He entered the war, I believe, as a private and organized a battalion, I believe, which he headed up. And it wasn't long before he was promoted to general. And I'm using Warner's Generals in Gray as my source. I believe I thought he ended up as a four-star general, but he ended up as a lieutenant general, going from basically private to lieutenant general. And in that respect, he was like Andrew Jackson. He's like anybody who is so good at what he does that he makes it look effortless. There were others as well. Nathan Bedford Forrest came from modest circumstances. Some of these others, two of these others, did not come from as modest circumstances, but still, they illustrate the point. John Brown Gordon, who rose from captain commanding a company at the beginning of the war to a lieutenant general in the Confederate Army and, a major general in the Confederate Army, commanding a corps at Appomattox in the Army of Northern Virginia. And then Wade Hampton, and all three of these gentlemen had no previous formal military training in terms of an education at West Point or something like that. Wade Hampton, from South Carolina, starting out as the organizer of Hampton Legion and ending up as a lieutenant general at the end of the war. These guys are models for these other officers. And so during the war, even after the first 2 years, many states in the Confederacy continued the practice of allowing the men of the companies to elect their officers. Part of this was born out of the spirit of Jacksonian democracy. Part of this, and it's related to Jacksonian democracy, is born out of the idea, the antipathy towards the way the British did it. Because until, even after the Napoleonic Wars, in order to gain a commission in the British Army, one of the main ways to do it was purchasing that commission. And it didn't require anything in the way of ability. One hoped that there was ability there, but as long as your father had money, you could purchase a commission. This was not something that went with American culture. The idea behind electing your own officers was the men could pick their leaders who they felt were qualified. And their criteria for picking these leaders had to do with demonstrated ability, popularity, leadership. But of course, before the war, all those qualities would have had to be demonstrated in civilian life, or if they were old enough, in the Mexican War. My own area of research right now is Polk County. And whenever I get the chance, I add information to my database on soldiers who serve from Polk County. And I've got 2 8-year-olds. The last time I got over to the library was last spring. I've got a window of about 3 days in a couple of weeks when I'm out of school and they're not. So I may get 1 or 2 more trips out there. But some of these individuals illustrate that point. William Bain, he was elected 2nd lieutenant of his company, Company D, the 3rd Tennessee Infantry Regiment. And part of it was his demonstrated ability and the fact that he was known throughout the community as someone who had accomplished something. His occupation was farmer. The value of his real estate, $4,000, his personal estate, $1,000, which was quite substantial back then. Bible, also County, he served as 1st Lieutenant of Company B of the 29th Tennessee Infantry Regiment. He was county clerk. He wasn't worth as much money. His collective real estate and personal estate value was $1,000, still nothing to sneeze at that time. He was known in the community. He started out as captain of Company C of the 3rd Tennessee Infantry Regiment. He was a farmer. He had a personal and real estate value of $3,000. Okay, this value, this money, this wealth, it's not just wealth. It demonstrates that these people have accomplished something. And it's something that they can be measured by the people who they'll be leading in battle. And again, it's in the absence of other criteria. Because I don't know of a single army that had by this time written up criteria for what constitutes an infantry captain, or for that matter, an infantry lieutenant. They had started the process with the United States Military Academy, but it was a long way from being complete. So thus they had to rely upon this process for evaluating, okay, who's going to be a good officer. One of the sources of my information is a book called Mountaineers in Gray. It's about the 19th Tennessee Infantry Regiment. It's a book by John Fowler. And one of the gentlemen who he has profiled, John Hanna of Polk County as well. His father was wealthy. He and his father had organized a company that was part of the 19th Tennessee Infantry Regiment. And because of his abilities in that area organizing the company, he was elected as the company captain. And apparently he'd done something right. He ended up being promoted to major. He was later killed in combat in late 1862. Again, he illustrates that same process. And this book, Mountaineers in Gray by John Fowler, is part of a new direction in regimental studies, which cover the battles, the campaigns, and also talk about the individuals, where they came from, the context of their entry into the war, who they were personally. The 19th Tennessee Infantry Regiment, we're fortunate that there's been 2 studies done of that regiment. The other one was done earlier in the 20th century. And we have more information about that particular regiment. The 19th is a regiment out of East Tennessee, including one company, 1 or 2 companies from the Chattanooga area, one from the Knoxville area, and the rest of the companies being from southeastern Tennessee or Sullivan and Washington counties. So these people were selected on the basis of abilities that they demonstrated up to this point. But again, it's a trial and error process. You don't have anything written down. And authorities recognized that this was a problem. And some statistics illustrate that this was a problem. Out of 40 officers who were initially selected as company officers of 10 companies in the 19th Tennessee Infantry Regiment, none of this will shock you until the last statistic. Of the 40, 1 is a question mark. We don't know what happened there. Of the 40 were initially selected. 4 out of the 40 remained in their positions. In this case, they were all company commanders. They remained in their positions as company commanders. 4 were killed in action. 1 died from other causes. 8 resigned. 1 of the 8 resigning because of illness. The other 3 others of the 8 resigning because of being wounded. 7 were promoted. None of this is out of the ordinary. But the one statistic which speaks to this problem as far as electing company officers was 15 of the officers were not re-elected. So they didn't have term limits, but they had their own form of making sure that bad officers didn't continue in their commands. But again, with a system like this, it's based upon what each individual thinks of his company commander. Now, a lot of the soldiers are going to be voting on the basis of what they see in combat and how the company commanders treat them and, the appropriate skills. Others, might vote on the basis of anger or vengeance or just being mad at sometime at his company commander. So it's very arbitrary. And that statistic, 15 out of 40, not being realistic or not being reelected, demonstrates that. Well, with 642 infantry regiments set up in the war, they didn't have the time to put together any criteria for what constitutes a good lieutenant or a good captain as company officers, or for that matter, as field officers in most of these volunteer regiments. There were some criteria for doing it at the upper levels of command. And of course, West Point started that process. But throughout most of the war, many of the states continued with this process of electing these officers. It would change, but it would change after the war, and it would change after the war because of, it was a trial and error process, and you didn't know what you would end up with. In terms of officers being incapable of leading their men in combat, or not being able to or willing to take the steps necessary to take care of their men, in terms of providing what they could for their men while in camp, not even in combat, or other deficiencies as well. This is a period when things weren't standardized as they are today. But what this did was, it demonstrated the need for standardization. That you had to write down what qualities were expected in a particular position. Whether it's a company commander, or the major, lieutenant colonel, or colonel of a regiment. And then once you identify what those qualities are, instilling those qualities or developing those qualities in your officers. None of that could be done during the war. It would wait until after the war, and it would be done as part of a painful process. Not just in the United States, but Britain, Germany, France, all of these countries went through this process by way of hard knocks, experience gained, and oftentimes mistakes made over and over and over again. Now again, for every person who was as successful as someone like Nathan Bedford Forrest or John Brown Gordon, you might have 100 or 1,000 or even more officers who obviously would not have been as successful. And again, it's one of the qualities in American culture. We see someone who is a model for excellence. They're so good, they make it look easy, and everybody thinks that they've got the same chance of being able to do this. Just doesn't work out that way. After the war, Western countries, in part because of the experiences of the war, put in some reforms, but again, it took a long time. It was a very painful process. all tied together as far as standardizing things. Part of this was civil service reform, so that if you wanted a job in the government, you had to fit a particular set of criteria. And then once you got that job, if you wanted to get promoted, again, you had to meet the criteria for that promotion. In the Army, the process went much more slowly. It took a long time to standardize what was expected of junior and senior officers in the U.S. Army. Or, not to mention the United States Navy. It was a painful process. It was one that was beset by politics as well as disagreements among general officers. And it really wasn't until the 20th century that you get the establishment of schools that teach officers first how to be junior grade officers, and then after that to go on to be senior grade officers. And now, of course, the United States Army leads the world in terms of military education, having different schools for first lieutenants and captains, then majors, lieutenant colonels and colonels, and then finally to those who make it up to the general ranks. And it was the experiences during the war that helped pave the way for it. Not immediately, but over the longer term. And again, it was a number of changes that they're not visible to many people who read about the Civil War, but they're very important, because if you don't have a well-organized army, you can't get it to where it needs to go. You can't even feed it, let alone get it to where it needs to go. Do you have any questions?
With the soldiers being able to vote and elect their officers, did they ever in the same way reduce their officers by voting to reduce an officer or to reduce somebody?
That's a good question. As I understand it, if an officer was not reelected, then his options were limited. I think he had to either resign or rejoin as a private.
How often would the re-election come up? I missed that, I guess.
They didn't have a set, for each unit was different. There was a big reorganization that occurred in 1862. It was actually a series of organizations that went on from the spring of 1862 to the end of that year. And it was brought about because of casualties and also because of dissatisfaction with officers in this area, Shiloh, Stones River, Chattanooga, Chickamauga, etc. That was the first major reorganization after 1862. After that, it was hit and miss. There was no set date for all the units to re-elect their officers. And the officers or the units, there was nothing written down in the regulations saying units will re-elect officers every year. It wasn't like in our Constitution. It wasn't that well organized because they hadn't expected that. That was one of the things with the war. Both sides underestimated how long the war was going to last. I mean, a lot of people who had joined in 1861, by the time the latter half of 1862 was rolling around, they were surprised. I mean, they were getting used to it, but they were surprised. And from the statistics that I've read you from the officers who were in the 19th Tennessee Infantry Regiment, a lot of those guys just didn't come back because they were ill. They just couldn't stand up to campaigning life. I mean, it's not just battle, which of course occupied a very small percentage of your time, but it's also living out in the field. You usually left with the option of resigning and leaving the Army, or re-entering as a private. I guess there were times when they might offer you a consolation as a non-commissioned officer or something like that. Generally speaking, though, if you did that, then of course you had to deal with the awkwardness or even the shame of being in the same unit with men you commanded, and now you're at their same level. Especially if things hadn't worked out, and one of the reasons they didn't re-elect you was because you didn't know what you were doing, or or you had done something that had made a lot of people mad. That's the one thing about voting, and I have a feeling it worked just as well for soldiers as it does for civilians in elections. If we get mad, and if people are dumping on us, we might not be able to do anything about it, but we can take it out on people when we go to the polls. You can take it out on people and vote against people. You can get angry, well, I'm just going to take it out on this guy. I can't do anything about my boss dumping on me. I can't do anything about the cut in pay or not getting a raise or not getting a promotion. This is all this person's fault, so I'm going to vote against this person.
Why could officers resign and go home, but enlisted people couldn't?
I think the Confederate, and I can't cite the specific laws, but I think the Confederate Congress tightened that up so that those officers who did go home would have to have some reason for doing it. Otherwise, they would be expected to re-enter the Army as either enlisted men or as non-commissioned officers, especially after 1862. With the first draft legislation in 1862, then of course the writing was on the wall that they were going to need all the men they could get. So if you wanted to go home or you needed to go home, you had to demonstrate something like illness, or you had to have been wounded. And of course, for junior officers, that often would have been the case. In my own research, I've read so many officers who ended up with debilitating illnesses, fevers of one type or another that went undiagnosed, but the symptoms were very, very real. So if they could demonstrate illness or if they had been wounded, then they could go home. If not, especially after 1862, it would have been more difficult.
Did the Union elect their officers?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Same thing.
Yeah, and in fact, for them, it was even worse. Over 2,000 regiments were organized as part of the Union Army. So you do the math with the companies, and 4 officers per company at the beginning. Now, I don't know to what extent state governments continue to allow that up in the Union, but I think a lot of them did, and I think they encountered the same problems. Men who were well-intentioned, but again, and this is what I emphasize in my class, none of these guys had had any experience. You know, there were very few men who at the time of the beginning of the war had commanded even a regiment before the war had begun. So, I mean, my hat is off to them as far as taking on that challenge. Talk about being thrown into the deep end without having had any swimming lessons at all.
Did the Union have sometimes more problems than the South, do you think, with these bought commissions or elected officers?
I don't know if they had proportionally more problems. In terms of there being more regiments, there were more problems there. Now, one of the other areas that they had so many problems with, political generals. Because Lincoln, in order to keep the different states together, had made appointments of men as generals who were politicians who had delivered votes for the Republican Party, but who were not necessarily good generals. And that was certainly a problem. And it was a problem he had to live with in a number of cases. He couldn't afford to cashier these guys. If he was lucky, if he found a political general who didn't know what he was doing, he might be able to move him into a position where he couldn't do any harm. You know, making him commander of a fort in the northwestern corner of Washington State, or something, well, no, Washington Territory, or something like that. So I don't know if they had proportionally more trouble, but just the fact that they had over 3 times the number of regiments, yeah, it must have been chaos.
That could have been just as bad, I guess. You make somebody a political general, he's got 2 sons, he wants to make them captains somewhere or something like that, and it just snowballs, I guess.
And of course, one of the things that American soldiers were known for in the war was questioning authority. And I guess that's a more civilized way of getting rid of a bad officer, is not electing them again, not re-electing them. I guess it's more civilized than maybe killing them in the midst of a battle, just to make sure sure that you didn't get killed if you were being directed by someone who didn't know what you're doing, and you figure I either kill him or I'm going to end up getting killed when he leads me into a bad situation. But yeah, if some political general's got two sons, you just hope they can find, they're either good at what they're doing or find positions for them that won't do any harm.
A little different, but somewhat related. My great-great-grandfather was a battery after the coroner, and before they got to recycle. Their term was up. They'd been in since the First War, and as a unit, they elected to finish out the war however long it might take. So that was one good aspect sometimes of the election process.
Yeah, I don't have any figures, but I guess there were a lot of units that, they developed that cohesion and that dedication, and they stuck it out to the end. There was no giving up, and it was, sense of solidarity.
A couple of things you're overlooking at the beginning of forming the company level is, first of all, most of your companies in both the North and the South, the company commanders who raised, recruited, and trained the company. He basically made himself a captain in the unit, both of them probably knew he had done it. And the other thing is that before the war, every county had a militia. And it was more of a social thing than a military function, but they still had captains, lieutenants, and sergeants, and they met. And they come together and got drunk, basically, is what they did. But they did drill, and they made uniforms, and played military. So they did have that background going also. And of course, the militia always elected their people.
Thank you, yeah, I appreciate that. What strikes me is that the difference from today. In our society, one of the key things is standardization. Whether you're going for a college degree or for a promotion at work or in the military, it's written down. Everything is written down. And 150 years ago, it wasn't. Working at Cleveland State, nearly everything we do is written down. Everything that I have expectations for my students, it's written down. So this is part of something that, it changed the entire world. It's part of industrialization where everything becomes standardized so that you know exactly what to expect from a person or a part. And the analogy I use is the auto parts stores. You go to an auto parts store, you know what you want, you pick it up. It's very easy. You don't have to have any skill. You just look up the part in one of their parts catalogs, call out for the number. You use the instructions to put it on. That's part of the standardization, and it's a completely different world from 150 years ago.
One question now. The question is trying to get to what after the Civil War did go back to the military institutions, West Point, the Citadel BMI, that they learned that the war taught them, that they began to train their officers. In other words, recently in the Gulf War, we realized we didn't know urban tactics as well. So that was gone back and taught, and we're better at that now. But after the Civil War, those guys turned around within 80 years and win 2 world wars. So to talk about the underlying part, do we know after that war what went back to those military institutions that changed in, say, 2 or 3 big ways after that kind of a conflict about either tactics or any of it?
I think the big part of it was setting up new schools. And one of the first schools that was set up, it didn't last long, but it paid the way. One of its names is School of Application. And it was a school set up at Fort Leavenworth in 1881 by Congress at the behest of senior generals of the U.S. Army. It was set up, actually not coincidentally, just after Upton Emery had committed suicide. He was a very young general in the Union Army during the war, and he was also a reformer. The School of Application, it wasn't completely successful. What it was supposed to do, which which teach lieutenants and captains the most recent military theory, and also give them the experience to act as lieutenants and captains in model infantry and cavalry companies. That is actually carry out the duties. Because, within 5 years of the war's end, the Army had gone back down to pretty close to its pre-war size, around 35,000 men. The Union Army had, I guess, had been up to about just very roughly 2 million, and the Confederate Army up to 1 million. And most of the officers, within 10 years of the end of the war, were back serving in garrison posts out west. And it was not exciting duty, and it didn't give them a chance to hone their skills or even to learn their skills. So I would say it's the schools that were set up, especially in the very late 19th century and then in the early 20th century. And also, one more thing that they did, and they did this slowly. They abandoned the practice of promotion through seniority. So you didn't have to wait for the person who was ahead of you to get promoted in order for you to get promoted into that person's place. They slowly, painfully went to a process of promoting people on the basis of perceived ability. Sometimes it was ability, sometimes it was perceived ability. And maybe the best example of that in World War I was John Pershing. Theodore Roosevelt, well, it was before World War I, it was when Theodore Roosevelt was president. He promoted him, I believe, from captain, because he'd held a brevet major's billet. And then during his term, he promoted him, I believe, from captain and all the way up to brigadier general. And in seniority, Pershing jumped hundreds of other officers. And boy, did it make people mad at the time. I mean, Theodore Roosevelt, I can't remember when he did that, but if it was before his re-election bid in 1904, I'm sure he lost hundreds of votes as a result of that. But that was a major change. That's like, that's breaking the ice, with that guy. And then when you see what Pershing did in World War I with the American Expeditionary Force, and a lot of it, by that time, it's industrialized warfare. It's not someone like Albert Sidney Johnston at the head of his army making himself vulnerable at Shiloh. It's industrialized warfare. Pershing is a manager. And he demonstrated that he could put together and manage this huge corporation, the American Expeditionary Force. So it vindicated Theodore Roosevelt's decision, and it also led to a number of generals in World War II or before World War II being similarly jumped. And it pretty much did away with, for all intents and purposes, the seniority system, which had been, it certainly had caused a lot of junior officers in the U.S. Army after the Civil War to go into other careers. My father's been doing some research on one of our ancestors, who is a collateral great-great-great-great-great-uncle of mine. And he had served in the Union Army during the Civil War. And then after the war, he wasn't going to wait around for a promotion every 10 years. He went to work for a railroad company and became an engineer because that's mostly what he had done during the war. He probably made the wrong decision because I believe it was in the 1880s he was killed by bandits in Mexico. So it's wrong career choice.
Thank you, Neil.